You know what nobody tells you about England? That the kettle boiling in a kitchen somewhere in Suffolk this morning is boiling underneath an oak beam felled from a forest that no longer exists, in the reign of a king whose name most people cannot remember. That the hand reaching for the light switch is reaching past plasterwork applied before Columbus reached America. That the floorboards creaking under someone's feet right now were walked on by people who believed the earth was the center of the universe. This is not about castles, not about abbeys, not about the 400 medieval churches still standing, not about ruins with English heritage signage and Tuesday to Sunday opening hours. This is about the other category entirely. The houses where someone's Wi-Fi router is plugged into a wall that was already 200 years old when the printing press first reached England, where the postman pushes letters through a slot cut into a door frame carved before the Tudors, where a family has lived, generation after generation, without the chain of occupation ever snapping. England has more occupied pre-1500 residential structures than any other country in Europe. Most people walk past them without registering what they are looking at. Some people live their whole lives inside them without fully sitting with what that means. The continuity of occupation, not the age of the stones, is the remarkable thing. The chain runs unbroken from a medieval world all the way to this morning. 7 towns, 7 entries, ranked from remarkable to genuinely extraordinary. No ruins, no museums. By the final entry, the concept of a modern house will feel slightly absurd. 7. Lavenham, Suffolk. Population approximately 1,800, 100 kilometres from London. Over 340 listed buildings. Residential structures on Water Street and Lady Street confirmed to the 1490s. Still privately occupied today. Here is what you need to understand about Lavenham before anything else. This town should not exist in this condition. It should have been redeveloped, modernised and largely destroyed like almost every other English market town across the 19th and 20th centuries. The reason it was not is not heritage protection. It is financial catastrophe. In the 1400s, Lavenham was one of the wealthiest towns in England. The wool trade made it richer per capita than most of London. Merchants built on a scale that matched the money. The Guildhall, the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, the weavers' cottages that still line Water Street. Then the trade collapsed. It collapsed completely, and it did not recover. The buildings stopped. There was no money to fuel the Victorian redevelopment wave that swept through medieval England in the 1800s and demolished most of what had survived the previous 4 centuries. Poverty preserved Lavenham. The financial ruin of its merchant class is the reason a family in a 1490s weaver's cottage is making breakfast this morning inside walls that were plastered before the Americas had been named. A resident who purchased one of those Water Street cottages described their survey appointment. The surveyor told them the oak frame was in better structural condition than most 1970s builds. Medieval oak, once it seasons for centuries, behaves closer to stone than to timber. But he also said something the resident has not forgotten. He said, "You do not renovate this house. You negotiate with it. Walk down Lady Street at dusk. The plasterwork is painted the traditional Suffolk pink, ochre mixed with oxblood, the original recipe unchanged. The timber frames lean with the particular geometry of 5 centuries of settling, upper stories overhanging lower ones, the buildings on either side inclining toward each other overhead. The 21st century does not recede so much as fail to arrive. The trade-off is precise. Every window in a Grade I listed Lavenham house requires listed building consent to replace. You are not the owner of that house in any sovereign sense. You are its current custodian. The house predates you. It will outlast you." 6. Rye, East Sussex. Population approximately 4,700, around 100 kilometres from London. Mermaid Street and Church Square contain residential fabric, confirmed pre-1500, still occupied continuously. Rye was once a Cinque Port, one of the most important harbours in medieval England. Ships from France and the Low Countries tied up at quays that no longer exist because the sea that made Rye rich quietly abandoned it. Over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, the shingle silted up, the river shifted, and the coastline withdrew 2 miles. A town built for ships was left marooned on a hilltop above dry fields. The economic mechanism is the same one that preserved Lavenham, delivered by different hands. When the reason to rebuild disappeared, the rebuilding stopped. What stood in 1500 largely still stands. The Mermaid Inn, rebuilt in 1420 on 12th century cellars, is still serving customers in rooms whose fireplaces have been lit continuously for 600 years. A long-term resident on Mermaid Street described the cellars beneath her house They connect. The whole street is threaded with tunnels the smugglers used in the 18th century, which the smugglers themselves had inherited from the medieval merchants before them. The floorboards in her upstairs bedroom have been walked on by 600 years of feet. When she moved in, she said, she spent a year listening to the house before she changed anything. The house had opinions. She learned to recognize them. Stand on Mermaid Street at 6 in the morning before the tourist coaches arrive from Hastings. The cobblestones are uneven in the particular way of cobblestones laid before anyone thought cobblestones needed to be level. The jettied first floors lean out over the pavement. Seagulls still call to a harbour that is no longer there. The trade-off is the one Rye cannot escape. In summer, the town is photographed thousands of times a day. Your front door is someone's profile picture. The residents are background figures in other people's idea of an English postcard. The beauty has a cost, and the cost is paid in privacy. 5. Dunster, Somerset. Population approximately 800. Around 240 kilometres from London. Pre-1500 timber-framed cottages along the high street still privately occupied under arrangements that trace back to the medieval estate. Dunster lies beneath a castle that has been held by the same family, the Luttrells, for 600 years, one of the longest continuous family holdings in English history. The castle watched the medieval cloth trade build the town. The yarn market in the middle of the high street, added in 1609, is the newcomer. The houses around it are older. The preservation mechanism here is concentrated ownership. The Luttrell estate controlled the surrounding land for centuries. When you own everything, there is nothing for an outside developer to acquire. The 19th century expansion that reshaped most West Country towns never reached Dunster because there was nothing to sell. The castle held the village in a kind of architectural amber. An estate historian who has studied the Luttrell papers described the feeling of standing on the high street. You are not standing in a preserved place, she said. You are standing in a place that was never released. The distinction matters. Preservation implies a decision to stop. Dunster never stopped. It simply continued, quietly, under the same ownership, through centuries that destroyed comparable towns elsewhere. The high street in winter carries wood smoke from chimneys that have been venting wood smoke since before the Reformation. The yarn market's octagonal timber roof throws its shadow across stones worn by 4 centuries of market days. The castle above, the moors beyond, the houses between, a composition that has held its frame since Chaucer's lifetime. The trade-off is written into the leasehold. Modification is not a conversation you win. The estate, now partially transferred to the National Trust, partially still Luttrell, enforces standards older than most nations. You do not redesign a Dunster cottage. You inherit it. 4. Stamford, Lincolnshire. Population approximately 20,000, around 150 kilometres from London, over 600 listed buildings, significant pre-1500 residential stock clustered around St Mary's, Barn Hill, and the streets descending to the River Welland. Stamford was one of medieval England's 5 great wool staple towns. It was rich enough to build in stone rather than timber, which is the reason so much of it still stands. It had its own university in the 14th century, before Oxford had it shut down. Its 5 medieval church spires have punctuated the skyline since before the Wars of the Roses. 2 preservation mechanisms operated here in sequence. Stone does not burn the way timber burns, so when the fires that erased the medieval cores of comparable towns reached Stamford, they failed. Then, in the 1840s, when the railway was being routed north, Stamford's aristocratic landowner, the Marquis of Exeter, refused to let it come through the town. The line went to Peterborough instead. Peterborough became an industrial city. Stamford did not. The Victorian redevelopment wave that demolished medieval England simply went somewhere else. A conservation architect working in Stamford described what it means to survey one of the Barn Hill houses. Ground floor 13th century limestone, first floor 15th century modification, kitchen extension Georgian, roof Victorian repair, modern electrical rewiring threaded through walls that have been absorbing alterations for 7 centuries. You are not renovating, he said. You are joining a conversation that has been going on since the reign of Edward I. Barn Hill in early morning light is honey-coloured. The limestone is the specific warm stone of the Lincoln edge, and it has been turning that colour in that light for 700 years. The Burley Arms, trading continuously from a medieval site since the 12th century, still opens for breakfast. The 5 spires still hold the skyline. The trade-off is bureaucratic. Every exterior alteration in the medieval core is an argument with the Conservation Office. The character of the town is now protected by paperwork. Residents accept this as the price of living inside a place that refused the 19th century. 3. Sandwich, Kent. Population approximately 6,800, around 100 kilometres from London. Strand Street is reputed to hold the highest concentration of pre-1500 timber-framed houses of any street in England, all still privately occupied. Sandwich was one of the original Cinque Ports. For 400 years it was among the most important harbours in England, the port where armies embarked for France, where merchants unloaded cloth from Flanders, where medieval kings met foreign envoys. Then, the River Stour silted up. The sea retreated 2 miles, as it did at Rye, but more completely. A town built entirely around maritime trade was left stranded among farmland. The collapse was so total that Sandwich essentially went to sleep for 3 centuries. No money meant no rebuilding. No rebuilding meant no demolition. What stood in 1500 largely still stands in its original configuration on its original street plan. Abandonment is preservation's quieter cousin. A local historian on Strand Street described the houses leaning into each other. The ground beneath them is reclaimed marsh that has been settling for 600 years. Every floor in the old town is slightly off-level. Every door in the oldest houses has been rehung at least 3 times to accommodate frames that have shifted out of square. "You do not straighten a sandwich house," she said. "You live inside its geometry." Strand Street at sunset has a particular quality of light. The jettied first floors overhang the pavement until the upper windows of houses facing each other across the street are only a few feet apart. The bells of St. Clement's, the same bells, the same Norman tower, ring the hour as they have rung it since the 12th century. There is almost no through traffic. The town is so quiet that you can hear floorboards creaking inside houses from the street outside. The trade-off is the one the geometry enforces. Floors slope, doors do not close square, walls are never quite plumb. Modern furniture does not fit in rooms built for medieval bodies and medieval possessions. You adjust yourself to the house, because the house is not going to adjust to you. 2. Shrewsbury, Shropshire. Population approximately 75,000, around 260 kilometres from London, over 660 listed buildings. The medieval core is enclosed by a loop of the River Severn, and inside that loop is one of the densest concentrations of pre-1500 timber framing in Britain. Shrewsbury was a fortified Welsh border town. Its wealth came from wool and cross-border trade, and its medieval streets, Fish Street, Butcher Row, Grope Lane, Milk Street, still carry the names they were given before Chaucer was born. The Battle of Shrewsbury was fought here in 1403. The buildings that stood on Fish Street that day are, in many cases, the buildings that stand on Fish Street now. The preservation mechanism here is geography. The River Severn loops almost completely around the old town, leaving a single narrow neck of land as its only overland approach. You cannot expand a town that is trapped inside a river. When industry came to Shropshire, when Abraham Darby was smelting iron at Coalbrookdale a few miles away and starting the Industrial Revolution, the new factories and terraces built outside the loop. The medieval core was bypassed by its own century. The river saved Shrewsbury the way collapse saved Lavenham. A resident of one of the Fish Street timber-framed houses described what it is like to live on a street where the buildings opposite were already standing when Henry IV's army rode through. The floorboards in her front bedroom tilt noticeably toward one corner. The door to her kitchen is shorter than she is. The windows are original leaded glass, uneven and bubbled, and the light through them in the afternoon is a light that nothing manufactured has ever matched. Fish Street in early morning, before the shops open, is essentially unchanged from its 15th century configuration. Butcher Row's overhanging jetties meet overhead. Wood smoke from chimneys still burning timber. The castle above, the abbey across the river, the medieval street pattern unchanged since the reign of Edward III. The trade-off is that Shrewsbury is not a showpiece. It is a daily working town of 75,000 people whose medieval core is where they shop, where they work, where they park with difficulty. Beauty and ordinary function are in permanent negotiation here. No one has decided to resolve it, and perhaps no one should. 1. Lacock, Wiltshire. Population approximately 1,100, around 150 kilometres from London. Almost the entire village is owned by the National Trust. Every cottage is still privately tenanted. Pre-1500 timber and stone throughout. Lacock is the entry that collapses the viewer's assumption that these places can be bought into to. You cannot buy a house in Lacock. You can only live in one. The village grew around Lacock Abbey, founded in 1232. After Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries in 1539, the abbey and surrounding village passed to the Sharrington family, then by marriage to the Talbots. The Talbots held the whole village, abbey, cottages, farms, fields, the bridge over the By-Day Brook, for 400 years. It was in one of the abbey windows in 1835 that William Henry Fox Talbot made the first photographic negative in history, a village that was already 3 centuries old when the camera was invented inside it. Then, in 1944, Matilda Talbot did something almost unprecedented. She gave the entire village, not the abbey only, not a house or two, but all of it, to the National Trust, on the condition that nothing essential ever change. The chain of custody went from medieval abbey to aristocratic family to national guardianship, without ever passing through the hands of a commercial developer. Not once in 800 years. The result is a village with no visible telephone wires, no satellite dishes on the old streets, no yellow lines, no modern shop fronts, no road signs of the kind every other English village accepts as the price of the 20th century. It is the reason nearly every period drama of the last 40 years has been filmed here. Pride and Prejudice, Cranford, Downton Abbey, Harry Potter. Lacock does not perform medievalism. It simply still is what it was. A current National Trust tenant described what it is like to rent a home from an institution legally required to preserve it. You are not a tenant in any modern sense, she said. You are a caretaker whose lease happens to be written in 20th century English. The word she used, caretaker, is the same concept that the Lavenham surveyor was reaching for with custodian. The chain is a chain of keepers, not owners. Your front door's colour is not your decision. The glass in your windows is not negotiable. You have purchased the right to live inside the place on terms set long before you were born. Walk the high street in grey weather. Stone cottages in a colour the Cotswold limestone turns across centuries. The abbey cloisters, where monks walked for 300 years before the dissolution. The barn where the first photograph in history was taken. No frame of reference that is not medieval or Tudor. The 21st century is parked in a field just outside the village and is not allowed to enter. The trade-off is total, and it is the point. You cannot own here. You cannot modify. You cannot impose yourself on the place. The National Trust sets the terms, and the terms are that you join a chain of custody that has held since the reign of Henry III. That is either liberating or suffocating, and which one it is reveals itself within the first year of living there. 7 towns, 7 entries. The thread connecting them is not heritage protection, not planning law, not civic pride. It is something else, and it is the thing no guidebook quite states out loud. Every one of these places survived because something else failed. The wool trade collapsed in Lavenham. The sea withdrew from Rye and Sandwich. A single family in Dunster held too tightly for developers to reach. The railway went past Stamford. A river trapped Shrewsbury inside its own medieval loop. A photographer's descendant gave Lacock away rather than let it change. Prosperity is demolition's patient accomplice. Every era that brought money brought demolition. The medieval was replaced by the Tudor by the Georgian by the Victorian by the modern. The only pre-1500 buildings that survived are the ones prosperity forgot. English Heritage estimates thousands of occupied dwellings in England with confirmed construction dates before 1500. Most people drive past them every day without registering what they are. Some people live their whole lives inside them without sitting with what it actually means. That the wall behind their headboard was plastered before Shakespeare's grandparents were born. These buildings are not remarkable because they are old. A ruin is old. A museum is old. A cathedral is old. These are remarkable because they are in use, because someone is inside them right now. This morning, in the full ordinary noise of a Tuesday, inside the accumulated time of 5 and 6 centuries. The past in England is not behind glass. In these 7 towns, it is where someone is boiling a kettle, where a child is looking for their shoes, where a phone is ringing against a wall that was standing before the phone was a concept anyone on earth could have formed. If you live in a pre-1500 house, what does it feel like? What does it ask of you? What do you understand about time and ownership and continuity that you did not understand before you moved in? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what the house has taught you. If this gave you something about England you did not have before, consider subscribing. We make the history that mainstream content skips, not because it is obscure, but because it requires sitting with it long enough to understand what it actually means.